I think we also have to agree that not only a lot of people, but also a lot or a variety of sport participation forms should be accepted, should be included in our mind in the world of sport. And maybe to illustrate this a little bit, in my research I differentiate between elite sport and leisure time sport, and most of the time I'm focusing on leisure or leisure time sport, making a difference between media sport and mass sport. So mass sport is the more active part of it, when you're doing sport on yourself, you're physically active and of course a sport participant. Well, keeping that in mind, we could say that we can identify a kind of continuum on which we have at your left side performance sport, in which more competitive, result-driven sport participation is at stake. Whereas at the other side, participation sport, the more recreational side or part of doing sports is mentioned. And within these two big worlds of sport, if you want, we can differentiate according to the organizational context. Not all of the sport forms, of course, are organized or provided by clubs. We can provide or we can participate in sport outside this club, and that's, I think, is important, not to stimulate that, but to recognize, to acknowledge that, because more and more people are physically active. If we recognize this kind of forms of being physically active as virtual sport participation or physical activity forms. Well, from that perspective, and as we know in the world of sport, the biomedical model of sport is the key feature, the key modus of representing the world of sport. Well, I would like to counter this a little bit, because at the very bottom of this pyramid, of course, you have this recreational sport activities, but not all of the participants at this bottom, of course, aim to be at the top of this pyramid. So therefore, we propose to use what we call church model of sport, in which we have different, or the variety of sport participation forms included, having the competitive sport at the one hand and recreational sport forms at the other. You don't have to agree upon that, but if we say that more and more people should be involved in the world of sport, well, maybe this kind of models should be integrated in making policy progress. Okay, if we agree upon the fact that doing sport policy, creating opportunities in the world of sport is important, to have as much people involved in sport participation and physical activity, of course, and I like to say that as a researcher, we need data, sport participation data. There is a strong need for basic data. For example, benchmarks, we have facts and figures already, some monitoring functions that started from the EU. But still, some data are lacking, and I can't stress it enough. We still need this kind of data, because the available data rather rely on isolated research projects. Is there something wrong with it? Not at all, but it makes it very difficult to compare data between the different studies we have. So it's a kind of mosaic that we have in Europe, also for doing sport participation research. Not only in comparing this data, but also, and that I think is really important for sport policy makers, if you have only one point of measurement, you can't say nothing. You need more points of references. So doing research again and again so that you can compare throughout time as well. Well, together with colleagues from the Mulier Institute in the Netherlands, my colleague Remco Hoekman, who is on the table over there, will give his speech later on, he joined us, and together with them, we launched this initiative, the Measure Project, which stands for Meeting for European Sport Participation and Sport Culture Research, trying to meet or to collect as much data as possible, to collect the available data on sport participation, etc. So it was launched in 2010 from our university. learn together with his colleagues at the University Institute. And in fact, three main goals are put forward. Increase the understanding of sport participation from a more quantitative perspective, if you want. Secondly, try to improve the quality of the data collected. And third, exchange this expertise, these facts, this data, the knowledge we have. So for those interested among you, you can go to this website mentioned over there. One of the first results out of that project is this report. You can download it for free if you want. Doing already, or at least some efforts to put together data that have been collected before on this topic of sport participation. I'm not going through it, we don't have the time, through it more in detail, but I will present at least some results from this report. And I will first focus, because before giving the floor to my colleague Charlotte, who will explain some or give you some more data and findings, I would like to focus on a very specific feature of doing sport, is the sport preference and the sport practice that is at stake. So, what we see from our research is that there is a large similarity in sport preferences among different countries. So, the top 5, the top 10, if you want, is almost similar between these different countries. And what is at focus? What kind of physical activities or sport practices are very popular? Are those activities that are individual, recreational, and based, of course, from a leisure time sport perspective. This kind of activities. So I think it's important to stress, to put forward the concept of what I call doing sport in a more light form, so light sporting communities. If we accept this as policymakers, I think more and more people will be involved in this sport world. So it's not that I'm asking for this, but as a researcher, I can only say the data are telling us, well, traditional club membership is somewhat dwindling, it's under threat. More and more people enjoy doing sports, but are not going to the sport clubs anymore. That might be a problem in the future. So people from the sports clubs, from the sports federations, I think, have to think how to attract people, more and more people, to their organizations. More and more people, as I mentioned before, are involved in non-competitive and non-organized sport. And that, I think, is an important thing. And I will try to illustrate this with some data, some slides in which we try to give the top 5 for each country being involved in our study, 12 countries, EU member states. Well, we see, for example, that for 8 out of 12 countries, walking is in the top 5. And of course, you can discuss whether or not walking is a sport activity, but it is at least a physical activity. Or fitness, 9 out of 12 countries, for 9 out of 12 countries, fitness-related physical activities are in the top 5. We see a quite similar picture for cycling, biking, recreational biking or competitive biking, 10 out of these 12 countries. Or swimming, 11 countries, and the same picture for running. At least running seems to be a very, very popular physical activity. Here in Denmark, in my country, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Germany, etc. So I think, again, from a policy perspective, it is important to take, or to consider at least these activities as worthwhile and to include it in your policy vision and program. So, Charlotte, up to you to continue with the findings.
Yeah, Jeroen already mentioned that sport is no longer only related to club sports participation, to competitive sports, so that is just for this slide is telling. So in theory, it looks like sport is nowadays for everyone, but we saw in our research and in practice, it is not the case at all. And what I will briefly discuss percentages based on Eurobarometer data, so that's data from the European Commission. First of all, with respect to overall sports participation, you see here a map of the European Union, and maybe just explain the colors a little bit. The blue ones are those that have lower sport participation percentages, and the more red are the countries with higher sport participation percentages. So you can immediately see that Scandinavian countries score higher than other countries, that Western European countries score higher than Eastern European countries, and then on average in the European Union we have approximately 6 out of 10 people who practice sport. And then I would like to say some words about the context of sport participation. It is already mentioned that club participation is under threat. So again, you see here from few club sport participation blue color to red. You see on average that in Europe 14% of the people participate in a sports club when they do sports, and as club sport is particularly dominant in Western Europe and also in Denmark. This is what you can see on the slide. So that's for the sports club. Of course, there are a lot of other ways to do sports. For instance, do sports in a fitness center. Again, from few to a lot. And here you see that sport participation in a fitness center is actually very high in the more southern countries. You see in Italy, you see it in Greece, also in Sweden, it's rather high. We see in Western Europe that these figures are much lower. And then what is interesting is that the other ways of doing sports, by other it's meant the non-organized ways of doing sports, like Jeroen mentioned, the running, the cycling, and so on. So on average, you see very high percentage of 35% of the people in Europe who do another way of practicing sport. And you see that it is mainly in the newer member states. You see it in Finland, in the Baltic states, that this non-organized way of doing sports is particularly high. So up till now, we just mentioned some differences between countries. Of course, there are a lot of differences between individuals. Older people practice less sports than younger people. People from higher socioeconomic classes participate more than people from lower classes, and so on. Here on this slide, we will just briefly mention some figures about the gender differences in sport participation. You see that on average, women participate 8% less than men in sport. But in some countries, women participate more or equal to men, and you see this particularly in the Scandinavian states, Scandinavian member states, that women participate more than men in sports. Again, in the southern countries, sport participation is dominated by men. So we have mentioned that sport has evolved into sort of mass phenomenon, not only club sport participation. So in theory, it looks like everybody can do sports, running, cycling, and so on. You don't need to be part of a club anymore. But if you look at the figures, then you see that a lot of people do not participate in sports. So sports for all, the answer is no. And there are some possible reasons for this. First of all, there's this fragmentation of sports culture. There is no uniform view on sport for all anymore. And then a second reason is that sport is very often used as an element of health policy. It's always sport, you have to do sport for your health. To promote sport, a lot of mass media campaigns are used, and they are based on other health behaviors, such as you can't smoke anymore, you need to have your seatbelt on, and so on. And these mass media campaigns, they want to change the behavior of people, they want to confront people with the consequences of their behavior. But But of course, sport is much more than other health behavior, dominated by a lot of other factors. So we see this on the slide. An individual does always have a social environment, always have friends, family, colleagues, and so on. There's also the physical environment. People need access to sport facilities. You need to live in an environment where you can be able to run or to use a bicycle and so on. And there are also the general national, cultural, or economical conditions that play a role in doing sports. What is the place of sport in a society? What is the type of government in a particular country? How are the social relations organized in a country? What is the general welfare level in a country? What is the role of the family? What is the role of women in a society? What is the role of religion, and so on? So all of these factors have an influence on sport participation of people. So to conclude, we can say that sport is a social phenomenon that finds place, but also gets significance within this broader social context. So sport is more than only an individual thing. A general conclusion is that policy action is needed on different levels. And for this policy action, of course, data is also needed on each of these different levels. And not only data, also research on each of these levels. So that is what we want to stress, that it's a social phenomenon that is more than something individual. So thank you for your attention.